Welcome to another conversation in practical theology with Sayyiddah Zaidi and Eric Stoddart. Today, we're going to be exploring how to handle uncertainty. Part of the reason for bringing this topic today is I was just reflecting on the fact that, there's a huge amount of uncertainty in the world that we live in. Many of us are experiencing a number of different paradoxes, whatever they might be. And it just got me thinking, how do we actually stay in the space of being able to kind of respond to all of the things that are happening to us, for us, against us, around us, and how do we kind of remain grounded within ourselves, but also kind of firm and strong in our relationship with God?
Hmm. I wonder if uncertainty is simply the normality. If we get times of certainty or certainty over some aspect of life, that's unusual. That's not the norm.
Yeah, that is true. And I suppose the only thing that we have some level of certainty over is the past. You know?
I'm not even sure if we do over the past, because our interpretations of the past will change
Mm,
as the years go by. And as we get more experience, we might reinterpret our past. So there's even an uncertainty about how we interpret the past, and what we remember from the past can be a bit uncertain because we don't remember everything. We were designed to remember bits of it.
yeah, that's true. And I mean, I don't want to go off into a tangent, but the place where that's taking me is what's the truth?
Hmm.
Because there's so many different versions of the truth, and I think that's the piece that also brings a level of uncertainty. But how do you stay in the paradox? How do you kind of stay in this, liminal space, all of the other kind of phrases that we know and have heard of, but there's still a question of how does one be settled there?
Yeah. I wonder if it's helpful to think of uncertainty as a spectrum and not either certainty or uncertainty, because there are degrees of uncertainty that some types of uncertainty can be much more unsettling than the uncertainty. Extreme example, the uncertainty of what Christmas present you're going to get, in my case, and the uncertainty of, say, a health diagnosis. Those are two very different types of uncertainty. One is a sort of exciting anticipation of what am I going to open on December 25th? And the other is, goodness, what am I going to hear when I get the phone call about a test result? So the sort of spectrum of uncertainty and the context in which it's happening seems to me to be really quite crucial.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's actually a really good point. And also our anticipation of what the answer is.
Mhm.
So sometimes, um, in fact, every year I'm supposed to, and I don't always, but anyway, go for a HbA1c blood test, and I've just got this assumption that it's always going to be okay. you know. So my level of response to the uncertainty there is actually really, really small. But when I was walking back today, I was just thinking that what instituted this conversation is, we have a level of certainty around the things that we think and what we're learning. We have a level of certainty around the impact of any exercise or kind of nutrition plan or anything like that. But um, where is the certainty in terms of the response that we're getting from God to our efforts that we put into worship and practice?
Mhm.
And this is just a huge amount of kind of trust in God. for that.
Yeah, because what is the opposite of uncertainty? Is it really, if we're talking faith terms, are we really talking certainty? Because I can think in the Christian tradition that I was part of, there were some folks who really were desperate to get certainty. So that, for example, if they were praying for someone in need, they wanted to get as many people praying as possible, because the more people who prayed, that in their worldview would somehow move God's hand. And I was never that sure about that, because that is perilously close to manipulating God or attempting to. And so it's one reaction to uncertainty is to try to get certainty and to try, certainly in some forms of Christian spirituality, to make God turn it into certainty. And I'm not sure that that's really, from a Christian perspective, what faith is about.
Yeah, do you know, it's interesting because my view on kind of asking other people to pray for you is that you're just kind of increasing your chances of a positive response if more and more people ask. And not to say, I mean, I think God hears everyone, but there is a, you know, is it uncertainty or is it trust? I don't know.
I think trust in uncertainty, or in the midst of uncertainty, is probably the reaction and the response that a lot of folks would be aiming for. Because that's not getting the situation under your control, but it's saying that from a faith perspective, whatever happens, God is there. And that's a trust rather than a certainty.
Yeah, and maybe what we're doing is mm, well, I'm moving it from my action and all of the things that are in my control, just to recognizing actually that in many respects I have no control. And so this is this is the belief system that I have as a Muslim, but actually it's a belief system that I think many different religions have, and people of no faith also, certainly in the ones that I've kind of had this kind of conversation with, have expressed this piece of kind of like just surrendering to the universe or to nature, or somehow engaging with something that's beyond them. And so and it's interesting the use of the word surrender, because when I think about that, it's like, I don't know, I am not the expert, you know, and I'm trying to work something out, but I will kind of hand over to someone who's more knowledgeable than me. And in the case of prayer, for example, you know, in Islam it says God knows you, or is closer to you than your jugular vein. So that's the level of detail in which God knows. So God knows me better than I know myself. But intellectually, there's this kind of like, sometimes there's a game we play with ourselves when we think we know, and actually we don't.
Yeah, because there's something about that trust and the paradox between surrendering and still being an active agent in our own and other people's lives. Because certainly in Christian spirituality, there's a lot of language about surrendering to God, but that can be misunderstood in Christianity as to being some sort of extreme passivity.
It's a really interesting one, because I'm curious about why surrender is seen as something passive.
Mm. I think part of it is that in Christianity, or certain types of Christianity, there's a language about, well, we don't know, and we're going to trust God to work everything out. And almost a fatalism. If it's going to happen, God is going to make it happen. If it isn't, then that's God's will. And somehow surrender does get equated with passivity. Now, surrendering is a very active thing to do, but to not then get involved. For me, one of the almost the epitome of the danger of that is the language we hear from American politicians when there's been a school shooting, and they send their thoughts and prayers, but won't do anything seriously, politically, socially to deal with gun control. And the thoughts and prayers, that's the sort of surrender that to me is the epitome of passivity. And
Mm,
it's representative in much less significant and serious consequences in certain types of Christianity.
mm. So it's, because I think surrender is an active thing, and even when you continue to surrender, there's also an ongoing action within that, because at any point you can pull back,
Mhm.
you know. And the other piece is that as you're describing the kind of response of the politicians to the shootings in the US, that I get what you're saying, and I think from an Islamic perspective, the kind of idea that comes up for me is, you know, there's a prophetic hadith that says you tie your camel and then you leave the rest to God. And maybe the act of surrender is the piece of tying your camel, right? Because you're only going to do that once you've kind of put in a huge amount of effort. You know, you kind of are ready to be able to do that, and that there is a point at which, let's say, you know, if I really really want something to happen, there's a point at which I can do everything within my power, right? And I can do no more, and that's the point at which, you know, I kind of will leave the rest to God, because if I don't do that, then the uncertainty can become quite overwhelming, and it can take over and kind of seep into other aspects of life.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic insight because the point at which you've done all you reasonably can do in the process of handing it over, surrendering, when do you know that you've done all that you can do? And then if you're the sort of person that overthinks, you think, well, maybe there's more that I could do. I am still going to hand it over to God, but there's more that I could do. And that paradox of when do I know that I've done enough that's my responsibility to hand it over to God? And that's another level of uncertainty.
It, it is. And I think that's where I would listen to my gut feeling and my intuition, you know, because no one ever knows when they've done enough, right? There's always going to be more that you can do. You know, if I look at my PhD thesis, I mean, gosh, you know, it was the write-up period of it. You know, I was probably working 15 hours a day. I mean, literally, I'd get up, make my coffee, and go straight into my laptop. And it's not perfect, you know. The kind of things, I'm going to call them mistakes. It's a loaded word, but anyway, but the errors that I see, the mistakes that I've seen it after having submitted it, even after having the Viva, you know, those things exist and they continue to. But there is a point at which you know that you've done enough and you've got to let it go. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to move on.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting spiritual principle because it sounds odd to say, "Oh, it's good enough," you know, whether it's a thesis or whether it's some aspect of life. Oh, that's good enough. If you've been sort of brought up with some sort of perfectionist strain hanging around, that's an anathema to say,
Mm,
"Oh, it's just good enough." But actually, that's maybe the element of that paradox that I've thought about this enough. I've prayed about this enough. I've worried about this enough, or I've
mm.
taken enough action. Enough is just such a powerful word.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I like it, if, for example, the five prayers a day that a Muslim does, if I was to analyze every single prayer in terms of like the quality of it and my level of certainty that it would be accepted, it would just take up my entire day, and I'd probably go into a level of anxiety and depression that is just not helpful for anybody,
Hmm.
you know. So
Hmm.
there is a level of certainty that once I've completed, I've done the best that I can, and it's kind of like there's a new page and a new prayer and a new opportunity.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a positive statement of enough. Because I'm not even sure that I would always, certainly, I know I wouldn't always be able to say I've done my best, because I could have probably done it a bit better. And I think that enoughness of life, especially if you overthink, and if there's a in Christianity, in spirituality, there's a language about scrupulosity, that people can be over sensitive about getting the prayer right, about praying enough and or being faithful enough. And there is this sort of psychological, spiritual language about scrupulosity and ways of avoiding that. So there's an intention and there's a seriousness, but it doesn't flip over into then that worry and overcompensation. Again, it's about trying to deal with the uncertainty.
Mm. So how do you handle uncertainty?
I would go back to where I started, that that's the normal mode of life. I might not be right about that, but I think now at this stage in my life, I'm sort of more reconciled to the fact that uncertainty is the norm. If there's certainty about something, then that's unusual. That maybe when I was younger, and I don't know if it's a younger person's thing, searching for certainty. And then there's a certain point where you're more comfortable sitting with uncertainty.
Mm.
Maybe that's just me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when I was younger, I was looking for more certainty, but the irony of that is that I could sit in more uncertainty,
Mhm.
which doesn't make sense. But it's like as you keep your options open, or you try and um do many different things, then there is much more uncertainty in your life. And there's something about how the capacity to be able to do that is really quite broad.
Mhm.
Um, and as I'm getting older, I'm being more deliberate about the things that I do where there is a level of uncertainty. And then as I say that out loud, I also think, is this just some sort of false kind of uh, space that I've created for myself, whereas actually the reality is that everything is uncertain and I'm just trying to pretend that some of it is a bit more secure than it might be.
But I think we need to do that, even if it's pretending. I think we can't live with that heightened sense of uncertainty unless we're forced to. I'm thinking here of folks in war zones and folks in violent domestic situations. The uncertainty is intense and crippling, and they need a huge amount of courage. But outside those sorts of extreme situations, we're not really designed to live with that degree of total uncertainty. So there's something about familiarity. Maybe that's another, it's not an opposite of uncertainty, but a trivial example. I don't, I will go back to the same coffee shop because I know that it's good coffee. I don't want the hassle of having to make choices. I just want to go back to something familiar.
Mm,
I don't want that uncertainty. Now, that's a very trivial, and there's an opportunity to choose there. But I think familiarity is one of the important counterbalances to uncertainty, because we can't live on the edge unless we're forced by others to have to live on the edge.
mm. I agree, and I think that like the notion of the coffee. So, for example, I'm trying to reduce my caffeine, and I've said that I can only have 5 cups in a week now. And so I need to have a need is a strong word in this scenario, but anyway, I really want to have a good cup of coffee if I'm going to drink one. And if I taste it and it's not to my standard, it doesn't matter if I bought it or if I made it, I won't drink it.
Mhm.
And that's an interesting piece in terms of this bit on uncertainty, because I'm trying to bring um, a, a quality to the level of certainty that I have around the taste of my coffee.
Mhm.
And yet it's out of my control completely.
But yeah, as I suspect, as you were bringing up your kids, you wanted them to be certain that they were going to get a meal at certain times of the day. And that was an important part of your relationship with them, that they didn't need that uncertainty.
Yeah.
And the way that we're brought up, the way that we're, whether spiritually or physically, whatever, there's a certain degree of uncertainty, but yet there's only a certain amount of uncertainty that we can ideally live with, and we don't want to make others uncertain.
Mm, yeah. And I think we want to help others' uncertainty go away,
Hmm.
you know.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I agree. I think there as a parent, you want to give your kids as much certainty and security and care and comfort as well. And so it's interesting using all of these different words, because maybe the kind of the end for now of this exploration is that whilst we have a huge amount of trust in God and there is a level of uncertainty, actually within that relationship, there is also a huge amount of care and love that is going from us in the acts that we're doing towards God and from God towards us.
Yeah, because if the person who is, I don't want to say responsible for our certainty, but is part of that uncertainty and certainty life that we're living, if that person can be trusted, that makes a huge difference to not knowing everything that they're going to do, but you do trust them. And so it's a certainty about who they are rather than what they're going to do. Now, I wouldn't want to put too much of a divide between that, but I think there is something there about the sorts of people that we feel certain with,
Mm,
know exactly what they're going to do in every circumstance, but we trust their character. And that seems to be one of the ways that we handle uncertainty in our social relationships and maybe spiritually as well. It's not certainty, but it's assurance about character.
Yeah. And confidence that whatever we're trying to do, as long as we, have the right intention, do the best that we can, and all of the other things that go with that, actually, to your point from earlier, we have done enough, and whatever and however that might look in a particular point in time is enough. And that's the piece that actually gives us certainty.
Mhm. On the other hand, if someone is in a situation of extreme danger, there's no certainty that it's going to come out okay, whether someone's a person of faith or not. And that, I wouldn't want to forget about that.
Yeah, I think that certainly, and I could be wrong, but it's harder for the person that's looking at the situation than for the person themselves.
Mm.
And why am I saying that? If I look back to the car accident that I had, I mean, it was a horrendous time, and I was right in the middle of a huge amount of uncertainty. And as complex as that was for me, it felt more difficult for others looking at me, because maybe they felt, I mean, a lot of them couldn't do anything other than pray and listen and all of those other things. Whereas I'm the one that at least had some level of agency within that's my situation.
I wonder if there is a difference, though, between an accident or an illness and someone who is in danger of someone else, whether that's an army, an individual, a community, that those are not exact parallels.
I mean, I completely agree. And I think that in terms of the uncertainty of conflict and war, a lot of that is man-made.
Mhm.
And that's where my kind of boundary in this conversation kind of stops, because if it's man-made, then what's fueling these things.
Mhm.
And there's so many other complexities within that uncertainty, because yeah, yeah, I'm not quite sure how much one can influence these things.
Mhm. Yeah, and maybe that's again the degree of uncertainty, the degree of paradox, that this is much more acute and much more intense depending on the context
Yeah.
and the different actors, agents that are involved. Maybe the spectrum is a much better way of thinking about this whole area than sort of it's certain, it's uncertain, it's confidence, it's un unconfident.
Mm,
It's the spectrum, and again, putting it right back into particular contexts are going to be different.
yeah. And maybe that's the place where we pause for now, because there's a number of different questions that this raises, and I hope that the viewers and listeners are somewhat stimulated by this exploration of uncertainty and what that might mean for you, for us, for the world. And we'd love to hear from you. So if you've got any thoughts or comments, please do share them below. We also share our contact details, and would love to hear from you about this or any other topic that you'd love to see us explore in Conversations in Practical Theology. Thank you so much, Eric. I've got a lot of pondering and reflection that I'm going to do after today, and it's been a delight to speak with you as always.
Likewise, you always leave me with more to think about as well. So thanks to everyone also for listening or watching.